Under the dim glow of flickering candlelight, the ancient wooden pews of the cathedral seemed to tremble with anticipation as Vicente moved silently through the shadows. His palms were clammy with nervous sweat, clutching the coarse, frayed rope that had been discarded in the darkness behind the altar, an artifact of the church's bells, now transformed into a symbol of defiance he could no longer ignore. The air was thick with the scent of incense and burning wax, mingling with the faint metallic tang of sweat on his skin. Outside, the congregation's voices rose in hymns, their melodies soaring like prayers carried by the wind. But Vicente's heartbeat hammered in his ears, drowning out everything else. He pressed his trembling hand against the rough fabric of his altar boy robe, feeling the weight of his secret, the quiet rebellion simmering beneath his skin. His eyes darted toward the massive stained glass window behind the altar, where sunlight fractured into shards of crimson and gold, casting fractured reflections across the marble floor. The bishop, Dom Americo, was already beginning his solemn procession, his robes flowing like a river of white and gold, his expression serene but with a hint of smug confidence that irked Vicente more than he cared to admit. As the bishop approached the pulpit, his voice resonated through the cavernous space, warm and commanding. "Today, we celebrate resurrection, renewal, and sacrifice," he proclaimed, eyes scanning the crowd with practiced fervor. Yet Vicente, standing amidst the hushed whispers of the congregation, felt a gnawing emptiness, as if the truth buried beneath layers of ritual and gilded icons was choking him from within. With a rapid, almost instinctive motion, Vicente slipped from his seat, clutching the coarse rope tightly in his fists. His heart pounded louder as he made his way toward the altar, where the great bell's rope dangled like a snake, ready to strike. A sudden surge of adrenaline propelled him forward. "This is for the truth," he whispered under his breath, voice trembling but resolute. As he reached out and grasped the cold, frayed fibers, he saw the bishop's eyes widen in surprise, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. With a sharp pull, Vicente yanked the rope downward, the sound loud and jarring, a thunderous toll that seemed to echo through the very marrow of the church. The rope coiled around the bishop's neck, catching him off guard just as he began to speak, and in an instant, his face turned crimson, eyes bulging in shock. Gasps erupted from the congregation, voices rising in panic and horror. Vicente's breath caught, a mixture of fear and catharsis flooding his senses. The bishop staggered, choking, as the crowd stared in stunned silence. Vicente, trembling with guilt, took a step back into the shadows, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions, regret, liberation, and a desperate hope that, somehow, this act of chaos would crack open the suffocating silence that had long enshrouded the church's dark secrets. The echoes of the chaos lingered in the dim, cavernous nave as Vicente pressed himself against the cold stone wall, his heart pounding like a frantic drumbeat in his chest. The congregation's collective gasp had morphed into frantic whispers, rising like a tide of shock and disbelief. For a moment, the sacred silence that usually filled the cathedral was shattered, replaced by trembling voices and hurried footsteps. Vicente's eyes darted toward the altar, where the bishop was now doubled over, clutching at his throat, crimson staining his pallid face. An altar boy nearby shouted, "What did he do?" While a graying usher hurried forward, panic etched into every line of his face. The bishop's assistant, pale and trembling, hurried to his side, calling for help as the church doors burst open and uniformed officers stormed in, their guns drawn and flashlights piercing the darkness. Vicente's mind spun in a whirlwind of conflicting feelings: regret, fear, and an almost unbearable rush of relief that he'd finally shattered the suffocating veneer of sanctity. His trembling hands clutched the rope, knotted tightly in his palms, as he watched the scene unfold. The bishop's assistant knelt next to him, voice trembling. "Your Grace, breathe. Can you hear me?" But the bishop's eyes rolled wildly, the color draining from his face. Vicente's voice caught in his throat as he realized the enormity of what had transpired, the weight of his act pressing down on him with relentless force. In the chaos, Vicente's gaze met the eyes of his fellow altar boys, their faces a mixture of shock and silent question. What had he done? What would happen now? The police began cordoning off the area, and a stern officer approached, demanding, "Step back, kid! What's your name, and what's your story?" Vicente's lips trembled as he took a half step forward, his voice barely a whisper. I just wanted the truth to be seen." His words hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken emotion and the raw pain of rebellion. As the officers gently but firmly led him away, the cathedral's sacred silence returned. But it was forever altered. Shadows danced along the stained glass windows, casting fractured light on the battered altar. And Vicente knew that the act he'd committed, shocking, impulsive, and tragic, had irrevocably changed everything. His mind replayed the bishop's strained face, the choking gasp, and the terrible power of that moment, an act born from betrayal, hope, and desperation, now etched into the very foundation of the Church's battered soul. Narrative development following. Desenvolvimento específico da narrativa seguindo rigorosamente o prompt original. Parte 3. The story continues. Exploring the central themes of the original prompt, with unique characters and engaging situations that keep the reader interested in the development of events and conflicts presented in a rich and detailed manner. The cathedral's towering stone walls seemed to close in around Vicente as chaos erupted behind him, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and defiant exhilaration. Shadows flickered across the stained glass, casting fractured, multicolored patterns that danced over the altar where the bishop lay gasping, clutching his throat. The congregation's gasps and muffled screams echoed through the vast nave. But Vicente's mind was a tumult of conflicting emotions: rage, fear, and an unshakable sense of necessity. As he hurried toward the exit, footsteps pounding behind. Him! He heard the priest's voice, sharp, commanding, calling for security, for the police. "Stop him! He's dangerous!" The words felt distant, like a thunderclap reverberating in a cave. Vicente's breath caught as he darted past the pews, adrenaline surging through his veins, igniting a reckless courage he hadn't known he possessed. His hands trembled, clutching the frayed rope that once rang the bell, a symbol of divine summons and communal unity. Now transformed into a weapon of rebellion, he had chosen this moment, this sacred space, to reveal the rot beneath the holy veneer. "You betrayed us all," he whispered fiercely to himself, eyes burning with a mixture of pain and resolve. With a sudden, desperate pull, he looped the rope around the bishop's neck during a lull in the chaos, the thick fibers tightening as the bishop's face contorted in shock and fury. The crowd froze, witnessing a scene so surreal that it seemed to hang suspended between nightmare and revelation. Vicente's body tensed, tears streaming down his face as guilt and defiance clashed within him. "This is the truth," he muttered hoarsely, voice trembling but unwavering. His mind reeled with the weight of what he'd done. Was it salvation or damnation? Was he the hero exposing corruption or a reckless criminal? The bishop's muffled coughs echoed in the vaulted space as Vicente's grip slackened just enough to realize the gravity of his act. He stumbled back, eyes wide with horror, knowing he had crossed a line that could never be undone. A rush of sirens blared outside. The heavy wooden doors shook under their force, sealing him in a storm of guilt and revolutionary fervor. As the authorities burst in, Vicente's chest heaved, and he looked back at the altar, now stained with the shadows of his rebellion, understanding that the act that had begun as a desperate cry for truth had transformed into something far greater, a catalyst for upheaval, reflection, and the painful journey toward a fractured but awakening faith. Narrative development following. Desenvolvimento específico da narrativa, seguindo rigorosamente o prompt original. Parte 5. The story continues exploring the central themes of the original prompt, with unique characters and engaging situations that keep the reader interested in the development of events and conflicts presented in a rich and detailed manner. Narrative development following. Desenvolvimento específico da narrativa seguindo rigorosamente o prompt original. Parte 6. The story continues exploring the central themes of the original prompt, with unique characters and engaging situations that keep the reader interested in the development of events and conflicts, presented in a rich and detailed manner. The aftermath of Vicente's shocking act rippled through the small town with an intensity that shattered the fragile veneer of peace that once cloaked it. His body was dragged away from the altar. Blood, mixing with the cold stone floor as whispers turned into shouts, and the once silent church erupted into chaos. The community, stunned into a hushed reverence or rage, stared as the police arrived, their sirens slicing through the morning air, drawing a stark line between the sacred and the profane. Inside the church, the stained glass windows cast fractured, multicolored light over the pews, where faces contorted in shock, denial, or disgust. The bishop, pale and trembling, was hurried to the hospital, a shadow of his former authority, his reputation now tarnished beyond repair. Meanwhile, Vicente was led away in handcuffs, his youthful face streaked with dust and tears, but his eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering light. "You don't understand," he whispered to a friend, voice trembling yet unyielding. This was never about violence. It was about revealing the truth. His words echoed in the minds of all present, stirring a blend of fear, curiosity, and a flicker of recognition. As he was taken into custody, a group of quietly rebellious townsfolk gathered outside, some murmuring in anger, others in silent agreement, their eyes fixed on the church steeple that loomed above like a monument to both hope and hypocrisy. Reports of the event spread rapidly, igniting debates on morality, faith, and the corruption lurking within sacred walls. The community's collective conscience was prodded awake, yet beneath the surface, divisions deepened. Some saw Vicente as a martyr, a misguided hero who dared to challenge a corrupt institution. Others branded him a dangerous agitator, whose reckless act had desecrated everything holy. In the days that followed, hidden meetings took place in shadowed corners. Secret, voices promising reform, exposing long-standing abuses, and questioning the very foundation of their faith. Vicente's mother, tears streaming down her face, clung to her prayers, whispering, "God help us all," even as her heart ached for her son's suffering. The bishop, meanwhile, grappled with shame and betrayal, knowing that the church he once served was fractured beyond repair. Yet amid the turmoil, a flicker of hope began to emerge, a recognition that perhaps this act of desperation had ignited a necessary awakening, a painful but vital step toward truth. The town, scarred but awakening, grappled with the profound realization that faith could no longer be blind, that truth often required a price too high to pay, but impossible to ignore. The story of Vicente's rebellion lingered like a ghost in the collective memory, a haunting reminder that sometimes the most powerful acts of faith are born from the depths of despair, and that true change often begins with a sacrifice that fractures the old to forge the new. Narrative development following. Desenvolvimento específico da narrativa, seguindo rigorosamente o prompt original. Parte 8. The story continues exploring the central themes of the original prompt, with unique characters and engaging situations that keep the reader interested in the development of events and conflicts presented in a rich and detailed manner. Narrative development following. Desenvolvimento específico da narrativa, seguindo rigorosamente o prompt original. Parte 9. The story continues exploring the central themes of the original prompt, with unique characters and engaging situations that keep the reader interested in the development of events and conflicts presented in a rich and detailed manner. The cathedral's vast, echoing silence was shattered as Vicente stepped onto the cold marble floor, clutching the thick, frayed rope that had once been silent. Witness to countless chimes and prayers, the air was heavy, thick with the scent of aged wood, wax, and a restless tension that seemed to pulse through the stained glass, casting fractured rainbows across his trembling hands. His heart hammered in his chest, a symphony of fear, fury, and an unyielding desire for truth. The congregation, hushed and dazed, watched him with wide eyes, some smirking, others recoiling in horror, oblivious to the storm raging inside his mind. He moved deliberately, a ghost in the sacred space, feeling the rough fibers of the rope tighten around his grip, the scent of incense intertwined with the metallic tang of sweat as he approached the altar, where the bishop's imposing figure stood, his chest rising and falling with practiced serenity, unaware of the tempest brewing beneath his serene facade. Vicente's voice trembled but found strength as he whispered fiercely, "Enough lies. The truth must be seen." Without hesitation, he looped the rope around the bishop's neck, the coarse fibers biting into flesh, as the crowd gasped collectively, some shrieking in disbelief, others frozen in stunned silence. The bishop's face contorted in shock, his hands instinctively reaching up, clawing at the fibers that strangled him, as a crimson flush stained his cheeks. Vicente's eyes welled with tears, partly from fear, partly from a cruel, righteous clarity, knowing full well that this act, symbolic and visceral, was a scream against centuries of hidden hypocrisy. "This is what you forced us to become," Vicente whispered through clenched teeth, voice cracking with emotion. As the bishop's knees buckled, Vicente released the rope, stumbling back, his breath ragged, his mind swirling with chaos and remorse. The church bell's distant toll sounded like a mournful cry, echoing the fractured spirit of a boy who dared to challenge the very fabric of his faith. The crowd erupted into chaos, shouts, accusations, tear-streaked faces. Yet Vicente's gaze remained fixed on the battered figure of the bishop, who gasped for breath, eyes pleading for salvation that would never come. In that moment, Vicente understood that he had torn open a wound far deeper than flesh, exposing the rot hidden beneath the gilded veneer of sanctity. His legs buckled, and he sank to his knees amid the shouts and whispers, the air thick with the scent of incense and blood, knowing that his act would ripple through history, transforming silence into a deafening chorus for truth. Narrative development following. Desenvolvimento específico da narrativa, seguindo rigorosamente o prompt original. Parte 11. The story continues exploring the central themes of the original prompt, with unique characters and engaging situations that keep the reader interested in the development of events and conflicts presented in a rich and detailed manner. Narrative development following. Desenvolvimento específico da narrativa, seguindo rigorosamente o prompt original. Parte 12. The story continues exploring the central themes of the original prompt, with unique characters and engaging situations that keep the reader interested in the development of events and conflicts presented in a rich and detailed manner. Narrative development following. Desenvolvimento específico da narrativa, seguindo rigorosamente o prompt original. Parte 13. The story continues exploring the central themes of the original prompt, with unique characters and engaging situations that keep the reader interested in the development of events and conflicts presented in a rich and detailed manner. The church's heavy wooden doors swung open with a creak, revealing Vicente standing at the altar, clutching the thick frayed rope that once symbolized divine calling, but now represented his rebellion. His eyes flickered with a storm of emotions: fear, anger, and an unyielding resolve. While the gathered congregation stared in stunned silence, the air was thick with incense and tension as he stepped forward, his trembling hands tightening around the rope. The whispers of the crowd grew into murmurs, then into shouts of disbelief. But Vicente ignored the chaos, his gaze fixed on Bishop Americo, who was still recovering from the choking grip, eyes wide with shock and betrayal. "You hide the truth." Vicente's voice cut through the muffled sounds, raw and trembling. "You preach salvation, but you serve corruption. Today I show you what your lies have wrought." With a deliberate, almost ritualistic movement, Vicente tugged the rope once more, causing the bishop to lurch backward, gasping for air as the knot tightened around his neck. The cathedral's stained glass windows cast fractured reflections on the marble floor, illuminating Vicente's determined face as he pushed the rope higher, symbolically lifting the church's hypocrisy for all to see. The crowd's gasps and cries morphed into a mixture of horror and intrigue, some clutching their chests in shock, others trembling with fear or outrage. Vicente's voice cracked, but he pressed on. "This isn't just an act of defiance. It's a cry for truth, for genuine faith beyond hollow rituals. If we keep silent, we become accomplices in this cruelty." Tears streamed down his face as he realized the weight of what he had done, had inadvertently enacted a symbolic hanging of the church's corrupt facade, risking everything for a moment of brutal honesty. The bishop's staff clattered to the ground as he fought for breath, eyes pleading silently for mercy. Vicente's heart pounded with a mixture of remorse and liberation, knowing that his impulsive act would ripple through the community, forcing everyone to confront their own complicity. In that suspended moment, the church transformed into a theater of raw emotion and stark revelation, an altar of truth, stained forever by the dark act of a boy who dared to challenge the sacred. Narrative development following. Desenvolvimento específico da narrativa seguindo rigorosamente o prompt original. Parte 15. The story continues exploring the central themes of the original prompt, with unique characters and engaging situations that keep the reader interested in the development of events and conflicts presented in a rich and detailed manner. Narrative development following. Desenvolvimento específico da narrativa seguindo rigorosamente o prompt original. Parte 16. This story continues exploring the central themes of the original prompt, with unique characters and engaging situations that keep the reader interested in the development of events and conflicts presented in a rich and detailed manner. The church fell into a suffocating silence as Vicente's trembling figure stood at the altar, clutching the thick, weathered rope that once summoned the bells, symbols of divine call and communal voice. His eyes burned with a turbulent mix of fear, rage, and unwavering conviction, knowing that what he was about to do would shatter not only the stained glass windows but also the fragile illusion that held his community together. As the congregation watched in stunned disbelief, Vicente's voice broke through the heavy air, trembling but resolute. "You've hidden your sins behind robes and sermons, pretending to be divine," he shouted, voice echoing off stone walls, soaked with centuries of secrets. Without hesitation, he looped the rope around the bishop's thick neck, pulling with a force born from desperation, anger, and a longing for truth. The bishop's eyes widened in shock, his face turning crimson, as he grabbed at Vicente's hands, struggling against the invisible weight of the boy's act. Gasps erupted from the pews, the flickering candlelight casting elongated shadows across the faces of parishioners frozen in shock. Vicente's classmates, hiding behind columns, watched with wide eyes, their innocence shattered. Caught between fear and admiration, the bishop's muffled protests faded into a choking silence as Vicente's grip tightened. An act of violence that was both symbolic and visceral, a desperate attempt to unmask the church's cloaked hypocrisies. As the boy's strength waned, he released the rope, stepping back into the chaos he'd ignited, his chest heaving with the weight of his choice. The bishop slumped to the ground, gasping for air, eyes streaming with disbelief, and something darker. Shame, perhaps, or realization. The congregation erupted into chaos, some screaming for divine justice, others rushing to aid the fallen bishop, who now looked more vulnerable than ever before. Vicente, trembling and overwhelmed by immediate guilt, but also strangely liberated, turned away from the disaster he'd unleashed, feeling the cold sting of tears and the heavy burden of consequences. His mind spun with questions. Had he broken free from the oppressive silence? Or had he merely stepped into a darker abyss? His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he escaped into the shadows of the cathedral, knowing that his act would ripple through history, sparking waves of judgment, doubt, and perhaps eventual awakening. The aftermath unfurled like a storm tearing through the sacred halls of the cathedral, relentless and unforgiving. Vicente, breath ragged and trembling, pressed, his trembling hands against the cool stone pillar as if anchoring himself to reality. His eyes darted over the chaos. The bishop sprawled on the altar floor, gasping for air with wide, frightened eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries of secrets. The congregation erupting into a mixture of screams, prayers, and accusations. Some people were rushing forward, reaching out in frantic attempts to help the bishop, their faces contorted with shock and disbelief, while others clung to their seats, eyes wide with horror or suspicion. A stern voice bellowed from the back, "Somebody restrain him! He's a heretic! He's lost his mind!" But Vicente's focus was fixed on the bishop's trembling figure, the beads of sweat mixing with tears that streamed down his face, a silent plea carved into every trembling breath. Vicente felt his knees weaken as guilt clawed at his chest, a suffocating weight that threatened to crush him under its merciless pressure. "What have I done?" he whispered aloud, voice choked with regret and fury. His mind spun with images of hidden truths, the rumors of corruption, the lies cloaked in sacred robes, the secret dealings beneath the veneer of piety. His fingers clenched instinctively around the rough rope still hanging from his grip. Then suddenly, with a surge of primal resolve, he released it. The rope slipped from his grasp, and he staggered back, clutching his head as if to hold together the fraying edges of his sanity. The cathedral's stained glass windows cast fractured patches of colored light that flickered over the chaos, illuminating faces twisted in shock and betrayal. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the gasping sounds of the bishop and the murmurs of a congregation trying to process what had transpired. Vicente's heart hammered in his ears, pounding out a rhythm of both liberation and despair, knowing that this act had irrevocably shattered the illusion of divine justice they'd all clung to. As he retreated into the shadows, every step felt heavy, each one echoing the weight of a truth finally spoken, a silence finally broken. His mind was a turbulent storm of doubt and hope, tangled in the realization that perhaps this act, though born from rebellion and pain, had also ignited the possibility of awakening, of tearing down the walls of hypocrisy that had imprisoned them all. Yet, beneath it all, a whisper of fear persisted. What price would this rebellion demand? Would the Church's wrath be swift and unforgiving? Or could this act serve as a catalyst for true change? Vicente's trembling figure disappeared into the darkness of the cathedral's labyrinthine shadows, carrying the ghostly echo of a question that would long echo in the silent halls of history. Was this enough to set them free?